Okay, we're back on the record on State versus Loyd. Mr. Loyd's present with his attorney. State Attorney's Office is present. Mr. Linneman, you ready to go? Was that a yes? Okay. Let's bring the jury back in. State recognized presence of the jury. Defense. All right, may I call your next witness?
Tyrone Lawson.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and
You may inquire.
Go ahead, have a seat, sir. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Could you tell me your name?
Tyrone Lawson.
Okay. And where do you live, Mr. Lawson?
Paranoia.
And do you work?
Yes, sir.
What kind of work do you do?
I have my own cab business.
Okay, I'm showing you exhibit number 5. Do you recognize the people in that photograph?
Yes, sir.
Who are they?
Markeith Loyd and Markeith Loyd Jr.
Okay, and Markeith Loyd Jr. is Markeith Loyd's son?
Yes, sir.
Okay, how long have you known Markeith Loyd?
Probably since I was 14.
Okay. And did there come an occasion when he went to prison and you continued to communicate with him?
Yes, sir.
Did he ever ask you to do something in regards to his son, Markeith Jr.?
Yes, sir.
What did he ask you to do?
He's always had me to like buy shoes and like bicycles and stuff and chip in. You know, me and one of his cousins, Cree. We used to chip on stuff for little Markeith, as Markeith was taken care of from prison.
Thank you, sir. I have no further questions.
Cross.
No question, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You can step down.
Right through the middle, sir.
Call your next witness.
Dr. Marvin Dunn.
you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
This way, sir.
You may inquire.
Have a seat, sir.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Would you introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Yes, I'm Dr. Marvin Dunn.
How are you employed, Dr. Dunn?
I was employed as an expert witness on race in this case to help with the mitigation aspect of this case.
Okay. Let's talk about your background and your credentials. Can you give a summary and overview of your background and credentials, sir?
Yes. I was born in DeLand, Florida. Moved to Miami when I was 9. I attended Morehouse College for a bachelor's degree in psychology. I attended the University of Illinois, Roosevelt University for a master's degree in education and supervision. I attended the University of Tennessee at Knoxville for a PhD degree in psychology. I served 7 years in the United States Navy as a naval officer on aircraft carriers. I was hired as a school psychologist by the Dade County Public School System when I finished my degree in 1972. The following year, I was hired by Florida International University to teach in the Department of Psychology. I taught in the department for 34 years. The last 5 years, I was chairman of the psychology department at FIU.
And were you ever a licensed psychologist?
Yes.
When and for how long?
When I worked as a school psychologist, I was required by the state to have a license to practice as a school psychologist. But that was, as I said, 1972, 71.
Okay. Are you currently a licensed psychologist?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Can you tell us some about your involvement in the media and related to the work that you do?
I've appeared on many national broadcasts, ABC Evening News, CBS Evening News, NBC Evening News, Nightline, 60 Minutes, BET, Pravda.
And what were you discussing in those appearances?
Race relations, race conflict in the country and particularly in Florida.
Okay. And what efforts have you made to improve race relations in Miami?
I wrote a book on the 1980 riot in Miami that resulted in 18 people being killed as a result of a police beating of a black young man who was unarmed. It caused a riot, and I wanted to know what happened and how these things developed, so I did a book on that event that became the definitive document on the Miami riot of 1980. I was particularly interested in the reaction of the community and the reaction of the police and how this evolved. From that book, which was published, I think, in 1984, and because of the riot, I started a high school, an alternative high school, for youngsters who were disadvantaged and who were having difficulty staying in school. One of the things we found out was that a lot of the kids who participated in the riot had dropped out of school. And we thought that it would be a good idea to try to organize a school that would be better effective in holding on to kids who were at high risk of dropping out. So we had a school that had an equal balance of white, Hispanic, and black students. Most of them were disadvantaged. Many of them came from dysfunctional families, and our job was to prevent them from dropping out. And the school became one of the most effective alternative high schools in the state. It is now an adopted, fully accredited high school by the Dade County Public School System. It is the Dr. Marvin Dunn Academy for Community Education.
Okay, so you have a school named after you.
Yes, sir.
What,
May I mention one other, I'm sorry, may I mention one other thing to answer your question, if I might, sir?
Sure.
In terms of trying to improve community relations with the police. We've had serious problems in Miami-Dade County with the police and the black community in particular. And about 3 or 4 years ago, after some particular incident, I decided to organize a police appreciation day for the law enforcement officers in our community to show them that they had support in the community, that even though there were frictions in the community, that most people in the black community supported the police and appreciated the work that they do. And I solicited florist shops to donate roses for the officers, and we had maybe 150 to 200 officers present, and we had so many roses we gave them each bouquets as an appreciation for what they do.
And what you just talked about, is that addressing issues in the social problems in the public schools that you referenced, or is there additional information on that?
That was addressing what I've tried to do, one of the things I've tried to do to improve relations between the black community and the police in my community.
What is community psychology, doctor?
Community psychology is a branch of psychology recognized by the American Psychological Association, just as clinical psychology and other branches of psychology. What community psychologists do is we take what we know about clinical psychology and about social psychology, and we combine those ideas and theories to try to understand how people respond in communities. What kinds of things affect what people do that are not inside their heads, but inside the environment in which they live. Things that might affect how they developed as human beings from the time they're born, things involving, for example, family structure, family stability, poverty, disabilities, limitations of various sorts, abandonment, which is a very big issue that I've worked with over the years, where parents abandon their children. And most of the work I've done of late has shown that we're now facing double parental abandonment, where a lot of the people that I've worked with over the years have been abandoned by both their mothers and their fathers.
Now, in this particular case, you were provided material to review. Can you tell me what material you reviewed?
Yes. I reviewed the report from Suncoast Neuropsychological done by Dr. Joseph J. Sesta. It is a report on the forensic neurological examination of Mr. Loyd. I read the arrest affidavit involving this man. I read several handwritten documents that Mr. Loyd wrote and gave to me to read. I examined school records. I think those are the major things that I looked at.
Did you meet with Mr. Loyd?
Yes, I did.
On how many occasions and for what length of period?
I met with him 3 times. The interviews with him lasted between 3 and 4 hours each time.
And did you interview family members as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And based on all of that, did you reach a conclusion in regards to Mr. Loyd?
Yes, sir, I did.
And what is that conclusion?
I think Mr. Loyd is psychotic. I think Mr. Loyd, on top of being psychotic in the usual clinical sense, as we define psychosis, I believe he is a paranoid schizophrenic. I believe in addition to that, he also suffers from what I think is an extreme example of cultural paranoia added on top of his clinical problem. And he also has certain developmental problems as well that could be mentioned. But primarily, I agree with the assessment from the psychiatrist that he is psychotic.
Now, you had an opportunity during the course of your work to converse with other doctors in this case. Did you not? Did you talk to Dr. Sesta?
I did not, sir.
Okay. So did you review Dr. Sesta's MMPI-2 report and the summary?
Just 1 second, I can check and let you know. I have the full report here. I think it includes the summary. Yeah, I have it in hand.
And in that, he references Mr. Loyd through testing as delusional.
That's correct.
And psychotic.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's talk about, in your opinion, what are the life experiences that shaped Mr. Loyd's personality structure?
Well, Mr. Loyd grew up, I would describe it like a weed in a manure patch, poisoned environment, no guardrails provided by his mother or his father. It was as if he had to grow up on his own with very few limits being set And early on in his life, when he was younger than 10, he was stealing in order to support the family, just picking up food just to help with that. But his mother, whom I interviewed at some length, did not know that he couldn't read until he was in 3rd grade. When I asked him, how did you manage to get to 3rd grade and you couldn't read? He said, I could remember the answers, but I couldn't read, which told me he had a developmental problem. That's very unusual for a child to be able to do that. He had no support for his education aspirations, helping him with schoolwork, getting to school, things that he needed to be competitive in school. His life was surrounded by crime, drugs, violence. He was, at one point, kidnapped, beaten badly. His aunt told me she couldn't recognize him when he got home. He has managed to grow up, as people do under those circumstances, with certain things missing, crippled, damaged. It's not as if it was a normal development. There was nothing normal about this man's development. I think that's a general view of how I saw his upbringing.
Okay, I want to ask you some general areas and what your opinion is on those areas. Do you know whether he grew up with or without a father?
Without. His father had no real impact on his life.
Okay, let's talk about that. The effect from the community psychological standpoint, what that means in the environment that he's growing up in, how that affects someone like Mr. Loyd.
Not having a father, I think I referred to it earlier, the biggest problem with growing up, particularly in the environment in which he grew up in, is that the child doesn't learn normal limitations that you expect of a child. Developmentally, emotionally, without that kind of structure and guidance, they grow up wild. They may grow up, but it won't be what you want in the end. It's particularly important when it comes to raising black children, black males in particular, in urban environments today, where without a father to tell you how you treat the police, how you interact with the police. I raised 3 knuckleheads, and I had the talk with every one of them when they got to be 16 about how you respond in this environment so that you keep yourself safe and don't get into trouble with the police. Mamas can have that talk. They can do it, but it's not the same as having a father tell you what the limitations are. Because with the dad telling you, it becomes better internalized. So it's not that the person doesn't know it's wrong to do things. It's just that if there's not that parental guidance and limitations being set, you can end up with a very dysfunctional person. And particularly in this instance, coming out of an extremely dysfunctional family situation.
Now, did you learn anything about his schooling? You mentioned something about him not reading to till 3rd grade. Can you tell me about how that factored into your opinion?
It meant that he was intellectually crippled. It meant that the things that normal children who could read and also get the answers were able to make a lot more advances than he could, just crippling along trying to make do. It limited his development as a human being to be able to understand, interact with, and make decisions that were prudent and wise decisions as he grew up. One other thing, I'm sorry to interrupt you, one other thing about him and education is that he got passed on when the system knew he couldn't read, and they knew his limitations were what they were. And as often happens, they pass a lot of kids on, even with those limitations, knowing that that just increases the chances that they'll drop out of school and end up in trouble. So in his case, there were certain institutional failures as well. I believe the school system that he attended failed him in terms of being able to identify his problems early on and address them effectively.
Now, we heard testimony throughout this morning about him drug dealing beginning at a young age of 16 while he was living in Carver Shores. Tell us about your impression of that, how young black men get into this situation, and what are your thoughts as a community psychologist on this issue?
The temptation is so great. We could say, well, you shouldn't be tempted. But as a school psychologist, when I was working, going out into schools, even some of the kids who were in my school that I ran would say to me, well, Doc, I make more money than you do. And they did, on the streets. Why should I come to school when I can make $600 a night on Miami Beach? The temptations are great. The way in which young men are used as protection for older people who are committing crimes is endemic, where they put the young kids out to get arrested because they know they will probably get a lesser sentence. So one is vulnerable to being used by criminals who are seasoned criminals who know how to play the system, know how to use kids, particularly those who nobody's watching. And you have to have something to compete with that. And what kinds of things compete with a kid who wants to go out and do drugs versus trying to get him to do something else? He has to have a mentor. He has to have somebody he respects. She too, girls and boys, they have to have somebody that they know. It could be a pastor, could be a teacher, could be an uncle, could be a granddad, could be somebody that they respect and accept that person's judgment as to how they should evolve in their lives. The church can be helpful, schools can be more helpful than they have been, but basically kids get saved by individual people reaching out and bringing them in from the abyss, saving them from the dangers that we're talking about.
And did you discover that there was a period of time where Markeith and his sister Dana were basically raising the other children and themselves because the mother was not present?
Yes. It was one of the more difficult things to get at in the family interviews because families aren't often forthright in expressing what happened in these circumstances. But there were times I was told when they were eating ice pretending that it was steak. I was told that the lights would be off 2 or 3 days at a time. No mother in the house.
And did you,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, did you discover that there's a lack of stability even with the boyfriends that she was having around during periods of time?
It added to the problem.
Tell the jury about that. How did it add to Mr. Loyd's problem?
Because his mother was vulnerable to men who used her, abused her, and abused their income, who took her check. Christmas time came around, Mom had given the check to some dude. So how do you confront that with young kids? Because everybody's got presents. We're not having presents because Mama gave the check to somebody. And this was a consistent problem over time with her vulnerability to men who did not serve her or the family well and who provided terrible examples for the boys.
Did the community he lived in, Carver Shores, what's it like for a male in his situation, as you knew it to be, to have to grow up in that particular community in terms of being subject to violence and things like that?
The likelihood is increased exponentially. If you take a young man who was born, let's say in Coral Gables, Florida, who was white, whose parents were professionals, who gave him the kind of guidance and support that child needed, made sure that he had all the kinds of assessment to make sure he was not under-functioning, and then he grew up and ended up breaking the law in a serious way, hurting somebody, I can't square with that. You got everything you needed, nothing was denied, we were all here for you, Why would you go out and do something like that? I couldn't take a case like that. I need to know, how were you damaged in some way that was not your fault? Not to blame the mama, but what is it in your environment that led you to do something like this that wasn't all on you? Some on institutional failure, some on parental failures, some on law enforcement failures. So if I see a case where I can get in and talk to the person, talk to the family, do the research to find out that, yes, this person did something, I don't deal with the conviction. You get convicted by a jury, you're convicted by a jury. I want to know how much of this is your fault and how much of this is the fault of other people. And to reach a decision about recommending results to a jury, I base that upon what I think comes to me that explains this person, not excuses, explains his behavior in a way that maybe people listening could understand why the person did what they did.
Now, you had mentioned that at a very young age, he had to take care of others. How does that foster his connection to school when he has a disability and they're not providing a solution to that disability? Where does that draw him to?
Draws him to the streets, draws him to easy cash. And given the fact that even though he's not particularly well educated, he is very smart and is able to wind away in very difficult circumstances, even with the limitations that he has. But given the circumstances that we've talked about this afternoon, his chances of getting into trouble, serious trouble, are probably 10 times higher than that young man who was born white in Coral Gables with all the privileges and advantages that comes with that. Otherwise, you got to say, when we see more black people sent to jail, sent to prison, sent to the death chamber because of what they did compared to white people, then you got to say, why is that? Why are there so many more arrests, so many more incarcerations, so many incidents involving these youths? We can't say it just happens out of the blue. We need to find the sociological, psychological reasons to explain why we have so much violence, so much family disintegration, so much police excessive violence, which happens, and how we deal with this poison environment where we have so many young black men in particular who see the police as the enemy. How do we confront these things? And it's a very difficult challenge.
Now, did he have some experiences in his younger years? You had mentioned that, I don't know if you had talked about that, he had an incident where he was kidnapped. Did you get a chance to talk about that?
Yes, and I talked to one of the other person who was with him at the time.
Okay. And tell us what you found out about that and what you know about that.
Well, Markeith told me that someone approached him about stealing.
Judge, this is a...
Yeah, he's allowed to do this.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Markeith told me that another person approached him about stealing a car. He said he told the person, I'm not a car thief, I'm a drug dealer, but I'll go along with it. He said they went about trying to steal this car. They were discovered by a man named Pat, who they say was a very powerful person in the community, who thought that they were the, quote, jits, unquote, that stole a car before. So they were taken. I thought initially for a longer period of time than actually was the case, but for several hours, beaten severely, shot at as they ran, and that's what he told me happened.
Okay. And this event for someone who is 16 years old and had experienced the events that he had shared with you up to that point, how significant would that be to you as a psychologist?
It's a life-changing event. When someone shoots at you, after having beaten you as badly as he got beaten, that never leaves a person's life experience. You never forget that.
Did you discover that at some point his mother tried to place him in a treatment program hospital, and can you tell me what you discovered and why that's important?
Yes, I spoke with him and several family members about that, because the fact that he was put on a residential program at that age told me there was something wrong. Somebody saw something that was amiss enough to want to keep him in a residential program. He didn't want to stay in the program. He went with the understanding that his mother would sign him out anytime he wanted to leave. And as it turned out, the program wanted to keep him. His mother wanted him to stay, but he insisted that he was going to leave, and he did leave against the advice of his mother and the treatment facility. But I took that event to be a signal that someone saw something terribly wrong with this young man and wanted to keep him in the hospital.
So when you're 16 years old and you don't want to get help, is that the kind of thing that a mother or a government agency or others should allow if the best interest served is making sure the child receives treatment?
Yes, he should have been made to stay. He should not have had the option to leave.
So was there a failure there?
Yes.
And
both his mother's and the institutional failure. They could have maybe taken some steps to advise beyond their own program, perhaps a court that there was a need for intervention beyond what he was willing to accept at that time.
now you had mentioned that although he had learning disability, he was not at all unintelligent. What do you mean by that?
I mean that there are different kinds of intelligence, social intelligence, mechanical intelligence, academic, all kinds of intelligence. Some people tend to be higher in one area than in others. In his case, his capacity to comprehend ideas was normal, if not above normal. But his capacity to use his intellect instrumentally to read and to decipher what he thought he knew was limited. So there's a gap between what he was able to accomplish intellectually because his academic performance was so substandard.
And that is something that you observed that continued on in his life, including in his release from prison.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So I want to talk to you about, Doctor, what is the kind of inaccurate perception of mental illness and intelligence.
Oh, there's a belief that if you're mentally ill, then you're also intellectually impaired. Some of the folks who are most extreme on the psychotic scale are also extremely smart. The two things are not connected at all, but there's a perception that they are.
Okay. And is it an accurate statement to say that just because you're delusional and psychotic, that the words you're using and the thoughts that you may be transposing in conversations have to be completely delusional and psychotic as well?
It's unavoidable.
Okay.
If a person is suffering from those disabilities, their thought processes are very dysfunctional. They go in and out of reality and reasoning. Very difficult to keep them tracking in a certain way intellectually when they're talking. So you can see the disability just in talking to the person.
And so now I want to transition into this cultural paranoia that you did research on for this particular case. Tell us about what cultural paranoia is, and then I want to ask you some questions about Mr. Loyd.
I went into a restaurant once, and some white people came in after me, and they got seated before I got seated. My thought was they got seated before me because I'm black, and they're white. That might not have been the reason. They may have had a reservation, might have been a lot of other, but in my mind, the first thing that hit me was, hey, that was a racial thing. I'm driving through Orange County, rural area late at night. I have a white assistant woman in the car with me. We pass through a small town, we get out into the country, and behind me I see blue lights. I know what I'm supposed to do, but do I stop? I might not. I might drive on, do an OJ until I get to an area where there are people, and then I'll pull over. Why would I do that? Why would a black person not even think about doing that? Because there's enough in our culture, some of it true, a lot of it not true, much of it exaggerated, but it's all out there, that within the black culture, the African American culture, communicates that the police will harm you, that the police will hurt you, that you need to be careful of the police, that you can't give them a reason to kill you. You need to make sure that you show your hands, that you treat them respectfully. These are things that are within the black culture that are not necessary within the white culture. A white parent may tell their child when they give them a driver's license, respect the law, obey the rules, don't run from the police, and if there's a problem, then it'll get settled. They will not tell that child, you could get killed because you're white, because that's not true. But should a black parent tell their 6-year-old, their 18-year-old, you could get killed because you're black by a police officer who's afraid of you, who's afraid of black youth, who might shoot you faster than he would shoot a white kid, the same age, same social background? That's a reality that's out there.
And that's when you're referencing cultural paranoia as a norm where someone who was raised in an environment like yourself, I mean, you grew up in an environment where they had separate bathrooms?
I was born in 1940. I'll be 80 years old my next birthday. Yes, I went to the back door. I sat in the back of the bus. All those things were a part of my upbringing, including in Orange County.
And so your experience as a person may contribute just to the cultural paranoia in and of itself if it's just a norm.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
There are some people who have experiences that are significantly different than yours, that norm may be enhanced.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Some people who don't have a mental illness.
That's correct.
Okay. So for example, doctor, if a man is falsely accused of a crime and sentenced to a lengthy period of prison for a crime he did not commit, would that be something that contributes to that cultural paranoia?
Oh, yes.
And would it increase the norm?
It absolutely would.
Did Mr. Loyd communicate to you anything about his sentence for battery on the law enforcement and his sentence, drug sentence? Did you talk to him about either one of those?
No, sir.
Okay. In a hypothetical, if I was to tell you that there was some evidence that Mr. Loyd was falsely accused of 2 crimes and sentenced to a lengthy period of prison for that, would that be consistent with someone who would have an enhanced level of cultural paranoia?
Let me be as clear as I can about that. Yes. If the person already is paranoid, clinically paranoid.
Okay. We haven't got there yet, doctor.
All right.
I'm just talking without
yes,
paranoia.
Yes.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Loyd voice to you that he believed someone was trying to kill him?
Yes, sir.
Explain what he voiced to you.
He said the police was trying to kill him. That's what he said. He said the crackers are trying to kill me, the cops are trying to kill me.
He used the word crackers?
Several times.
Police?
Several times.
Okay. Now, if someone is mentally ill and they have a delusional disorder, which enhances their paranoia, what happens to the level which you would be the norm, an 80-year-old man who grew up educated, well-educated, grew up in an environment where they treated blacks different than whites, pulled over, whatever, someone who is accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and whether he believes it and it's true or it's not true, he has a belief in it, and now he has a mental illness. Where is he in the realm of that delusion?
I would say he pretty well tops it out. I think that would be the top of the scale. It would be the worst case scenario to have someone who is truly clinically schizophrenic, paranoid, who also experienced that hypothetical situation that you explained, would, I think, put the person over the top, would make it very difficult to bring that individual back to any sense of reason and understanding about his situation.
Let's talk about the belief system that you were able to obtain from Mr. Loyd when you met with him. What was his belief system about society, white folks, racism? Tell me what you got from him on that.
Mr. Loyd is of the view that America is a racist society. He is of the view that black people are persecuted by the society, that there is no justice in the country, that white racism is the bale of America, that unless there's some intervention by some other power, that this racism is destructive to the black community. He is mistrustful of most whites, although I asked him, of the people that you deal with in corrections who are white, do you hate all these people? Do you get along with all these people? And he's very interesting. He said, no, some of the crackers are okay. I get along with them fine. They don't mistreat me. I don't mistreat them. It's kind of a transitional thing with him. He could get along with white people who are in his space that he doesn't see as a threat, but it's a very small universe of people that he feels that way about. His view of whites in general is that they're out to defeat, destroy, oppress black people. And he uses incidents in reality. He doesn't just make it all up. He uses incidents that do in fact happen, police cases, police beatings, innocent black men being attacked or killed by the police. And in his mind, it is exploded into the worst possible thing from which there's no getting back from that. There's no understanding a court letting a white officer off who beats an unarmed black man to death. These kinds of things spin him into a belief system that is well beyond any that I've ever dealt with in any black person. I've worked with a lot of young black men who are alienated, angry, disaffected, abused, racially prejudiced against white people. He's probably the most extreme one I've ever worked with.
And do you believe that that is based in part in his delusional disorder? I think you characterized it as some form of schizophrenia, but do you believe that that's based in part on his delusional disorder?
Yes, sir, I do.
Now, does that delusional disorder bleed over into other things?
Absolutely. It's not just categorized in one aspect of the person's life. It has to do with his relationship or her relationship with other people, because everything gets colored, gets seen through this distorted schizophrenic prism. So the person is not dealing with reality. He is dealing with his interpretation of reality through his double illness, as I see it.
Now, you're aware also, in addition to this delusional disorder, that Dr. Sesta identified through the MMPI objective test that was done, that there is another doctor, Campbell, who has identified him suffering from post-traumatic stress symptoms. that right?
Yes, sir. I'm not familiar with the second one, but it doesn't surprise me that that would be found.
So you're not aware of Dr. Campbell?
No, sir.
Okay. Based on your review of the material and the discussions and even your conversations with him, did you see the symptomology surface after prison?
Oh, yes. He was in for, I think, 16 years and came out. People told me he was different. When he came out, his eating habits were different. He had certain restrictions that he seems to have picked up as a part of some sort of evolution while he was in prison. So people told me that when he came out, he was different.
Okay. Now, there was some discussion. Did you ever have any discussion with him about watching a TV show called Roots?
He brought it up. I asked him, when did you start having these feelings about white people, all white people being against all black people? And he said that he saw the movie Roots, and that film oriented him towards seeing white people in that way.
Now, Roots is a program, a movie that actually depicts the mistreatment of African Americans back in whatever time period it was.
It was a book by a man named Alex Haley, who, I think it's Alex Haley, I think. It was a book and a movie that dealt with black life in slavery in this country, and it depicted a particular black family from the time the family was brought from Africa all the way through the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was very, very bloody, very violent, very brutal film.
Do you believe that way back when he was 7 or 8 years old and he first discovered this movie, what would have been the reason that distinguished him from another black male who watched this, or someone who's a teenager, or someone who's a mother or father, or a white person, or whatever? What distinguished his reaction?
He watched the movie through sick eyes. His eyes weren't normal. He saw things that others people didn't see. We all saw the brutality. We all saw the history. We all saw that the country, white and black, was outraged by the movie and educated by the movie. Roots was a good thing. It really opened white people's eyes to how it was for blacks during slavery and after. But if you are mentally ill and you see something like that, it has the capacity to set a person off into another whole way of thinking and experiencing life. And I think that was one of the factors that influenced him in this way.
Now, there were some other things that happened in his life, and can you tell me what your thoughts are in regards to it being significant or not? He had a cousin who was killed in, I believe, 1996, named Wesley. Tell me what you know about that.
I don't know much about it except that it impacted him very, very severely. I think he saw the body. I'm sort of going by memory now, but I think he had a direct experience with this death. I don't remember the details, but I think he came home after he saw this body. May have to be corrected by the record, but the point is, when you experience a killing, under whatever circumstances, it stays with you the rest of your life unless you're a very unusual person. If you're a child, 15, 16 years old, and you see somebody killed, particularly somebody you know and care about, that creates a wound that you have a lot of trouble getting over. It's not just the death, it's the time in which the person was exposed to it, the circumstances in which the person saw the killing or experienced it, to then make a determination about what kind of effect it had on the person. And then if there was no counseling available, no one to go to get a better perspective or to express feelings about what had happened, that is detrimental to the person's development.
Now, did you also discover that he himself had a coworker that was robbed after he got out of prison, who worked at Texas Chicken?
Yes, I think he mentioned that to me when I asked, when he was explaining why he had weapons on him, that he was afraid of being robbed. He needed to do that for his self-protection. He gave that example, I believe.
And he told you that he himself had been robbed?
Yes, he did.
Now, did you have an opportunity to look to see if there was any kind of biological evidence related to anyone in his family who may have been suffering from psychotic or mental illness?
Yes. We know that schizophrenia is genetically based. It may skip over some individuals, may skip over a whole generation, but we know that schizophrenia is passed on genetically. And in this family, I think Mr. Loyd's son is institutionalized for psychotic conditions. And I think there are other indications that there were people in the family who were mentally ill. So it provides at least another flag as to whether or not this is a true psychotic person. It's in his genes.
Did you have an opportunity to meet with some of his family members besides his mother?
Yes, his aunt, his sister, at least one nephew, maybe two.
And many times in these cases, the state gets up there and says, oh, look at his brother. He's a truck driver. He went into the armed services, you know, and try to compare Markeith. What is the difference in Markeith's case compared to his family members?
You can have children come up in the same circumstances, the same bad situations, and some of them will turn out fine. Go on to high school, go on to college, get a job, and they're fine. Others in that same family may end up going the opposite direction. Why is that? Kids have different abilities to deal with what's coming at them. Some kids in that family may be smarter, better able to handle intellectually things that are happening or emotionally things that are happening. The child may have found a mentor, may have found someone to substitute for the missing parental support that's there. And it may also just have to do with the person's overall physical makeup, but they have any other kinds of disabilities. So in the same social environment, some people can do well if they have mentorship, if they have some sort of support outside of the home, if they have the intellectual ability and emotional ability and stability to be able to function in a very difficult situation, they can make it. But if the person is mentally ill in those circumstances, then the chances become less.
And so in your opinion, the mental illness is a huge factor in looking at the difference between him and his siblings,
That's correct.
besides all the ones we had discussed.
Yes, sir.
One moment, Judge.
Sure.
Now, Doctor, sometime in the last week or two, you're familiar with Miss O'Shea.
Yes.
She's my forensic mitigation specialist, and you've worked with her.
Yes, sir.
Did you have a phone conference with Dr. Mayer and Dr. Campbell where you discussed the case?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you know who Dr. Campbell is?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we did.
I have no further questions, Judge.
Cross.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon, sir.
Am I correct that every time you have testified in the context of the penalty phase of a capital case like this, it's been for the defense?
That's correct, sir.
And in this case, you were tasked to look at whether or not there were societal or cultural factors in the defendant's life that contributed to make him who he is,
Yes, sir.
and whether those factors would mitigate the murders that he committed of Sade, Dixon, and her unborn child.
Yes, sir.
You indicated you spoke with some of the defendant's family members.
Yes, sir.
You spoke, I believe, with his aunt, Lorraine Harp,
Yes, sir.
his mother,
Yes, sir.
his sisters,
Yes, sir.
his brother, Barry Jacobs.
He may have been at the session we had with several family members who were present. Ms. O'Shea kept the notes of the persons who were present.
And you spoke to them all to get an idea of the defendant's upbringing.
Yes, sir.
And based on all the reports from the defendant and his other siblings, there was no indication of any kind of domestic violence in the household growing up.
That's correct, yes, sir.
There was no report or evidence that the defendant was physically abused by anyone within the household, correct?
That is correct, sir.
And based on the information you received from the family members, the defendant and his siblings spent a lot of time with his aunt, Lorraine Harp, as well.
That's correct, sir.
And would you agree that Lorraine Harp, the aunt, was a very positive influence on him?
She wasn't his mama, she wasn't his daddy. She was a positive influence, but she had a very big role to fill.
Was she a positive influence?
Yes, sir, she was.
The defendant and his siblings also spent a great deal of time with their grandmother.
Yes, sir.
Would you agree with me that the grandmother was also a positive influence?
Yes, sir.
You talked briefly about a period of time where the defendant went into some type of facility as a juvenile.
Yes, sir.
And the information about that facility and what happened there comes from the defendant and his mother.
And I think the sister also referred to it.
Okay. But you have not examined records or anything to indicate any diagnosis from that facility or anything like that?
I didn't ask about that, but I was told that it was such a long time ago that such records didn't exist.
Okay. You also mentioned an incident when the defendant was kidnapped and beaten up.
Yes, sir.
All right. And according to what the defendant told you about this incident, another young man that he was with approached him about stealing a car.
That's what he told me, yes.
Okay. And he told you, the defendant told you that he went along and joined this man in this venture.
I think that's what he told me, yes, sir.
And he told you as they were in the process of stealing this car, they got caught.
Yes, sir.
The car that they were involved in stealing belonged to basically a neighborhood drug dealer. I believe
They called the man, and they said the man's name was Pat.
Okay.
That he was a drug dealer, but I'm not quite sure they used that term. They made it clear that he was a very powerful person in the community.
And the person who owned this car, do you know what race that person was?
I have no idea.
Do you have any indication that that incident had any racial motivation or racial undertones to it?
No.
Would you agree that this event did not contribute to his belief that the police were unfair towards him or out to get him or anything like that?
With the car incident, I don't think those two things were connected.
You talked a little bit about the defendant resorting to selling drugs.
Yes, sir.
And he did that basically because of the lure of the easy money.
No.
No?
I don't think so.
Okay. I mean, was he forced into that situation?
Well, that's an opinion. I think his social situation was one in which the temptation to get involved in crime was pretty great because of the deficits in the family. I wouldn't say he was forced to do it, but I think you have to recognize what the impetus of the behavior might have been to begin with.
And the temptation was because it was easy money and take off.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. You talked about various factors being available to help discourage young men from resorting to that type of lifestyle, such as the church.
Yes.
He wasn't heavily involved in the church as a child, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I think I may have been told he was taken to church, but I'm not quite sure about the extent of his involvement in the church experience.
Were you aware whether he went to church throughout his childhood and his teenage years?
I think he did.
Would you agree with me that the church would be a good outlet for him to go to if he needed guidance?
That depends on the church. Some,
any indication?
well, some churches may be able to help more than others, but it's a potential resource. If there's the right leadership in the church, right accessibility to the leadership in the church, and if the person who needs the help is willing to go and seek it from that person, then that could be a very helpful thing to a person in this situation. Except if the person is mentally ill and has psychotic problems, then the willingness to go to someone else for help is lessened.
And obviously, the church wouldn't be able to help if the defendant didn't go after him.
Well, I happen to believe the church should go to people who need help, not just wait for people to come to them, but they should go out and seek people who could be helped.
From what I gather from your direct examination, the defendant sees a lot of things through a racial prism, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Is that common, or is that unheard of in the African American community?
Is it unheard of?
Yeah, that you explained that that's kind of maybe not common, but not unheard of.
It is not unheard of. It's not unheard of.
Okay. Is it more common in the African American population who's been to prison to see things through that racial prism?
I think so.
In that sense, that would you agree that there are many African Americans who have been to prison who think similarly to the defendant?
Yes, sir.
Maybe not to that degree, but similarly.
Yes, sir.
And based on your discussions with the family members, the defendant was not raised as a child or a young teenager in that type of an environment, or that type of teaching.
Repeat the question.
Sure.
I'm not sure if I already.
The defendant was raised and taught as a child to be accepting of other people.
Oh, yes.
He was raised not to look at the color of a person's skin, but to look at what's inside of it. That was the teaching that his family tried to instill in it.
No one told me that exactly, but I would think that's probably what he was taught.
You've talked a little bit about this concept of cultural paranoia. That is not the same as clinical paranoia, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you have not diagnosed the defendant with any kind of, strike that. Cultural paranoia is based in part, based on what you're telling us, in a truth that African Americans are treated differently by society and the criminal justice system. There's some truth to that.
There's some truth to that, yes.
And there are degrees of cultural paranoia.
Yes, sir.
So the concept of cultural paranoia, if it has some basis in truth, is not really considered a delusion, correct?
Well, that's the point. If it's true, it's not paranoia.
Okay. And in fact, the cultural aspects of paranoia, in terms of lack of trust, especially among African Americans, fall on the mild, non-clinical scale of the paranoid continuum. It's not a clinical diagnosis.
It's not a clinical diagnosis. But what's your point again? I'm not sure I followed your last
Well, the
point.
cultural paranoia is not a clinical diagnosis.
It is not. That's correct.
It's not the same as saying somebody is psychotic or that they have a diagnosable mental disorder, correct?
It is diagnosable. We can tell when a person has extreme feelings of persecution or discrimination or extreme opinions about race. These things are measurable. I'm not sure which of them, if any, were given to him, but they're not exactly out there in space where we can't tell who is most paranoid, who is most likely to respond in a certain way based upon the particular illness that we might be able to, or abnormality that we might be able to identify.
You're familiar with the diagnostics of right?
I don't practice as a clinician. I don't offer myself to be an expert on it. But after 40 years in psychology, I know schizophrenic when I see one.
Okay. Would you agree with what is the DSM-5?
It's the instrument that's used by psychologists and psychiatrists to diagnose specific kinds of mental illnesses.
And would you agree with me that cultural paranoia is not a diagnosis that appears in that?
Well, I can answer your question that it is not, but I would like to offer an explanation for that, why it's not. Those of us who are members of the Association of Black Psychologists have argued for a long time that certain things like this should be included in these measurements, that these things are basically white determinants of behavior, don't take into account the black experience that might end up with the person having a different kind of score on a mental test. So there's been a struggle, at least for the last 50 years, between black psychology and what's basically, maybe just lack of a better term, white psychologists, trying to get them to merge the thinking that it's not just what goes on inside the person, it's what's going on outside the person that affects behavior. And that race and what happens in our society around race is one of those things that makes a difference between blacks and whites that can be measured. And if you're dealing with someone who is not mentally stable or who is psychotic and clinically paranoid, then you have a very unstable, very unpredictable, well, I guess predictable, yes, but a very unstable personality.
You talked a lot about the defendant's belief system. Would you agree with me that the defendant has a belief of a need for extreme control and order?
Yes, sir.
Is it his belief that he controls women?
Women in general or in particular?
Or women that he's in a relationship with?
Yes, those within who he has a relationship, yes, sir.
During your discussions with him, was there ample evidence that he has made efforts to control women that he's been in a relationship with in the past?
Yes.
Including Sade Dixon?
Yes.
In the beginning of your cross-examination, you said that you were asked to see if there were factors outside of this defendant that mitigate the murders that he committed in this case, right?
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
In your opinion, would you agree that the racism that he may have experienced in his life and his mistrust of law enforcement played no part in his decision to murder Sade Dixon and her unborn child?
I'm not sure that he made a decision to do that, since you put the question that way.
Okay.
I'm not sure that he decided to do that. That's not what I got in talking to him. My sense of it was that it was a spontaneous act. It was not planned.
Let me rephrase the question then. Did, in your opinion, am I correct, the racism that he may have experienced or his mistrust of law enforcement played no part in his decision to go over to Sade Dixon's house that night, right?
Correct, correct.
Played no part in whatever transpired there that night?
Well, it might explain to some degree why he didn't run.
Why he didn't run?
Maybe if he wasn't clinically paranoid, maybe if he wasn't a mentally ill person, maybe if he was not mentally ill, maybe if he was not a psychotic person, he may not have run. He may have stayed to try to explain himself to the police. Why did he run in the aftermath of the shooting? That has to be explained. If he thought that the police were going to arrest him and be unfair to him or treat him badly or hurt him, then he might run. That's not what we would expect or want someone to do, but in his circumstance, after the shooting, the fact that he ran has to be addressed. Why would he do that?
any racism that he may have experienced in his life or mistrust of the police did not play a part as far as what happened between him and Sade Dixon?
That's my view, sir. Yes, I agree with you.
And in your opinion, am I correct that cultural paranoia played no part in what went on between him and Sade Dixon the night that he murdered Sade Dixon in the trial? Right?
Played no part? Probably not.
How much do you charge an hour, doctor, for your time?
$200 an hour for research, $250 for testimony.
How many hours have you devoted to this case so far?
I don't know. I can tell you the amount I've earned so far, but I don't know the number of hours.
Okay. No.
10,500 so far.
Okay. I can have one moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Thank you, doctor.
You're welcome.
Redirect?
So, Doctor, when you become involved in these cases, one of the things that your responsibility is to define who the entire person is. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
Okay. There was questions about whether racism played a part in the events that transpired with Sade Dixon. Do you remember those questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I do.
Now, the person who showed up at Sade Dixon's house after whatever arguments they had in text, was that the same person you were talking about that was mentally ill, delusional, and suffered all these things that you talked about in terms of racism and paranoia and all that? Was that the same person that showed up there?
He took all of that with him that night.
Okay.
He left none of it behind.
So when he showed up and he is reacting to events, is his mind the mind that is delusionally based and paranoid based that is present when his reaction is taking place?
He told me what was happening in his mind when he did that. He
What did
described
he tell
it.
you?
In so many words, he said he was out of his head, that he was acting without thinking, that he was in some other place. And I asked him, well, why did you stop shooting? Why do you continue? And he said once he started, it was out of control until he saw some kids that made him come back to reality, or something like something brought him back. But at the time that this was happening, he said he was not himself. And there are other instances in his record where he has said the same thing, where he lost control, felt himself being out of the ability to make rational judgments, under the control of something else. And one indication of his paranoia is that from time to time he refers to being controlled by something else, being given directions by some other being. This is all classic schizophrenic behavior. So all of those symptoms went with him. The other thing that I would say about that incident is if he was not paranoid and just clinical, just paranoid, never mind the cultural paranoid, when that incident happened, he may well have had a sense that he was in danger and he had to kill, had to defend himself, and his paranoia may have been, I think it was a factor in his reaction when this encounter, whatever happened between him and the brother. I think his paranoia was a part of what he was responding to at that moment.
Okay. So just so we can clarify and work through the process here, when we're talking about cultural paranoia, a norm is someone who has X experiences that places them in a position that we'd call a norm. Experience racism, like you, real or whatever life experiences, you have a norm.
I hope so.
Okay. In this particular case, when Mr. Loyd walked into that at that house and met with Sade Dixon, his norm was up here with delusional thinking.
That's
Is that
correct. He
right?
was still a paranoid with delusional
Okay.
thinking.
The
Yes, sir.
delusional thinking, if we package it, is racism, which you said had no part of this, right?
In that particular moment, yes.
But you talked about how it could have had a part of it when he was believing that the police were trying to kill him because they were hiding evidence from him, and the press was distorting the facts after the fact. That's part of this racism play
Yes, sir,
and his
absolutely.
thought process.
That's correct.
But putting that aside, he's still delusional, and I know you can't speak to this. He's suffering from trauma-related experiences, and those are things that he's carrying into this scene, this event with him. And so those things, the delusional thinking, the trauma, which Dr. Campbell will talk about, those play a part of his thinking and his reaction to everything he does.
Totally. You
Including coming with 2 guns.
You cannot
Walking around with 2 guns. That's up here, right?
That's correct, sir.
And whatever happened between him and Mr. Stewart and Miss Dixon, his thinking wasn't here. His thinking was up here.
He was a dysfunctional person from the moment he arrived at that scene.
And you're aware that none of this is a defense to first-degree murder,
Absolutely not.
but it's a defense to the death penalty in Florida.
That's all I'm saying.
Now, when you talk about his control, his need for control, where does that come from?
It's part of the disease. It's part of the illness. Where the person is so frightened of everything that could happen, they try to keep total control over the things that they care about. So very, very hands-on, suspicious. Where were you? What were you doing? Who were you with? How do you spend the money? Can't relax and let a relationship flow. There's a need to be totally in control of every aspect of the other person's life.
Now, you would agree with me, Doctor, as a social psychologist.
Sustained.
As a social psychologist, have you seen this issue of control take place throughout your lifetime with people?
When I was principal of the Academy for Community Education, one of our female students, a black young woman, had her boyfriend, who she had a baby with, come on campus and shoot her, or tried to attack her on campus. Take that back. And we tried to intervene. We thought that this girl was in some danger. We couldn't get the police to really help us. They hadn't done anything. And that weekend, he stabbed her to death in her own front yard. I saw that. That was one of our students. And the man who did that was crazy to kill this girl like that. She was pregnant. He wanted to control her. He came to school every day during lunchtime, watching who you with. I said, this man is dangerous. I told the Coral Gables police, this man needs to be arrested. He's going to hurt this child. Well, go to the state attorney, go to the child protection. Until they actually killed that child, we couldn't do anything.
Now, in your experience, Doctor, have you seen people who would be on the level that you referred to when you're talking about cultural paranoia, where they have control or want control over relationships? Call it above norm, but close to norm.
Have I seen?
Yeah, people who are jealous, people who are possessive.
Yes.
What percentage of our population in relationships do you see, in your experience, that happening?
Well, there's probably a certain level of that in a lot of relationships, but not to the point of destroying the relationships, not to the point of getting to violence. There's probably some of that in a lot of relationships, particularly young people. There may be those kinds of suspicions. But when the person has to know everything you're doing, every check you write, every place you go, everything you put in your body, that's not normal.
Okay, now in this particular case, we've heard that he was objectionable to her eating meat,
Yes,
to her smoking pot with a child,
yes,
what she put in her body.
yes.
Okay. And would you say that is related to the delusional thinking?
I think it's related to the basic psychotic condition. The delusional part of it is one element, but I think it's more to the core of the disability.
Now,
Excuse me.
from the time that you met him till today, in any conversation you would have had with him, did he always espouse whether the police wanted to kill him or not? And what was that?
Over and over and over again. Over and over again. He kept saying, I was trying to give up. I was trying to give up. And they wouldn't change the media story about what had happened. And I tried to get people to help me give up, but they were after me. They wanted to kill me. He told me he was sending out signals to let the police know that he wanted to give up. But because of the news media coverage, he felt that he was such a hot figure in terms of being sought after by the police that he would be killed if they caught him.
Now, you had mentioned on direct cross-examination that the people who go to prison, the African Americans that go to prison, are very similarly situated to Mr. Loyd in regards to their thoughts about racism.
Well, not to the extent that he is, but you get some of that coming at people when they go to prison.
So would you characterize him as having an enhanced thought process?
Extremely enhanced thought process coming out of prison.
I have no further questions, Judge. Thank you.
You want to redirect on the, recross on the new stuff? No? All right. Thank you, sir. You are free to go, doctor.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's 5 o'clock, so we're going to stop for today. Same instructions as always. Don't talk about this. Don't look up anything. Have a good evening. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you. All right, anything else we need to address before tomorrow? Sure.
Indication from the defense of information tomorrow, so what time, I know I can on the vote. I will appoint for none of the requested that fairly so that, you got a position of that expert, what lane will work, I need to vote.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to talk to you all about the schedule. How much longer do you think you have for mitigation? It's true. What?
3 doctors and a couple civilians, Judge.
So just give me a time frame. Estimated
Early afternoon?
2, 3 o'clock?
Yeah.
Which then means we need to break so that you can redepose their expert before your expert testifies? So that would end us at 3 o'clock, right? Tomorrow, around then? Do you think it's a short depo?
Yeah.
Would it be enough that we could then do rebuttal tomorrow afternoon and then bring the jury back Wednesday morning for charge conference?
Sure.
Have you all taken a look at, so let's tentatively try that, see how long that depo is going to take? Have you, the defense, taken a look at the jury instructions, so final penalty phase jury instructions?
Yeah, my partner was looking at them. We were going to add some stuff based on what we were able to prove during penalty phase.
Okay.
We're going to ask for a list of the actually we think that we have shown.
On the verdict form or in the instructions? Because the verdict form's the verdict form, yeah.
And we would ask that they read the instructions.
Okay. State, I know you're objecting to the verdict form change because there's a standard verdict form now for these. Are you objecting to mitigators? How many are we talking, Mr. Lenneman?
I think there's like 18.
To 18 mitigators being read during the jury instructions themselves? Okay. All right. Is obviously the statutory ones are the statutory ones. Those are read. I don't know what you're going to argue, so I'm not. Anything else that you're looking at, asking for a change in the jury instruction?
No, only our continued objection to the killing of a child. And Mr. Valero indicated that you did not actually issue the order. I don't recall.
I did. It's in there. I denied the motion as written.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Ridgway?
So frankly, I'm just not sure what to do with the meeting. On October 18th, like Friday before the 5, Mr. Linneman sent an email to the court. Did not request relief. A little uncertain as to why it was sent. My concern, Your Honor, is that with this case reach a fifth sentence, get to the point of 3850, this is going to be Exhibit A, claim of Mr. Linneman's effectiveness for failing to have presented evidence that we had. I would at least like to have the court address this and
I don't have a motion in front of me, Mr. Ridgway. It's why I haven't addressed it. I have an email. I don't have a motion. I just have an email. This is, to me, like an email I get from, we get random phone calls and emails as judges that aren't connected to motions. We just don't really do much with them. I understand what you're talking about. I would also point out that if a jury came back with a death recommendation in here, we have a Spencer hearing that would then have to be scheduled, at which any additional testimony that the defense wanted to present would certainly could be presented at that time. I can tell you right now, the Spencer hearing, just based on the schedules, if it became necessary, would be several months away. I'm aware of the email. My Jay forwarded it to me because it came from when she reads them first to make sure I'm not being ex parte. So because she forwarded it to me, I assumed I could read it. And I did read it this morning, but I don't have a motion. I just have this email. I understand your concern. I don't know what I can do. I can't make my own motion.
I don't want to ask you to do, but we're aware this email is there, and the defense is not asking for anything in regards to this email.
I have received no motion. I don't see anything that's been filed. So I'm aware of it. It becomes an issue if there's a death recommendation. So I guess at that time, I'll certainly inquire as to the necessity of how much time would be needed for the Spencer hearing in order to allow them to put forth any additional evidence that they needed. Okay, sure. Anything else? All right. All right, raise your right hand.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
I have it with me.
You're going to have to turn on a mic so I can hear him.
I don't have it with me. I left my note in my cell, but I wanted to address the issue that he emailed you about some evidence where it was evidence that I had some kind of brain damage, but you didn't allow my defense enough time to present the evidence to the jury. So I want to object to that, and I want it on record. And it's supposed to be addressed to the jury and not to the judge. I have a right to be judged by my peers or the jury, how they say in this courtroom, and not you. Thank you very much. Go on about your business.
All right. Thank you. Anything else? All right, court's in recess. I'll see everybody here at 9 a.m. tomorrow.